Welcome to the Mining the Dalkey Archive podcast, an occasional podcast where we talk to Dalkey authors, translators, and fans about particular Dalkey books. And this is part of our ongoing Irish series. And today, Vincent Francone, who's the author of A Book No One Wants and a professor at Roosevelt University, has joined me again. And we're going to be talking about John Toomey's Sleepwalker, which is your debut novel, and the first book of yours that Dalkey published. So, John, welcome.
Thanks very much. I'd love to be here.
I love to be here too now that we've got the time straightened out. For anyone
Yeah.
anyone on the back end who doesn't anyone listening to this and wants to know a little bit of like how the sausage gets made, I mixed up the time zones by putting Central Time way ahead of Irish time. So we were all
Yeah.
discombobulated here, but we made it. We
Yeah, we're here. We're here.
we're here. So I think I'm not sure exactly where to start with this, but I want to talk to you about your career first. I mean, the book Sleepwalker is an amazing book. It's a book about a guy, Stuart Byrne, who is having, sort of like early life crisis issues. He's got a job being in marketing and advertising for like a food company in Ireland. He goes through a lot of women. He has a very best friend named Rachel, who he's very close to and has a very platonic and satisfying relationship. He finds out early on that one of the women he slept with, who he doesn't particularly like, is telling him that she's pregnant. Rachel then sort of half declares her love to him. This becomes a problem. He doesn't know what to do. He's skipping work. He's just sort of like the title says, sleepwalking through life, and has to come to some sort of decision by the end of the book. Decent enough
Yeah, I
description?
think that's a fair synopsis, I suppose. Yeah.
And I have to say, like, as we are all teachers, we all are professors, and it was the end of our semester, and I've been grading papers like nonstop. And in between that, reading Sleepwalker, best idea. I loved reading this. It was so enjoyable. I would crush some papers and be like, "Yep, you get this grade, you get this grade. I need to get back to this book because I'm like, I need to know what happens next." I love it. It was beautiful. So,
Well, Charlie, but just to point out, first of all, this is not the first time this has happened, actually, when people from the US have interviewed me and you've elevated my status to professor, and
oh,
I'm not. I'm a
okay.
secondary school teacher, so I'm high school.
Oh, okay,
And
okay,
that's it,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah. And it's just a way. I think a lot of our schools are called colleges, and therefore people assume
That's
that
right.
that's a professor. But you guys are much more qualified than me.
Oh, I am not. That man is. Vince definitely is. I am a poser and a
No,
professor.
I'm as am I. I am always sort of reminded internally, maybe it's my Catholic guilt upbringing that although I have a mere master's degree, I've somehow, because I teach at a school that some was a little short staffed, that the first semester they hired me, they're like, "Can you sub for someone to teach Shakespeare?" And I said, "Sure." And then I had to reread all of Shakespeare over a summer, and it's like I'm not qualified to do this. They're just letting me. And now
Yeah.
it's just throughout. So
Yeah,
yeah.
well, I was wondering actually before we were coming on, there was kind of like a people saying, "Why are these people interviewing you?" And I was thinking it's a little bit like that in that I'm thinking, you know, a lot of things have kind of fallen my way because literally I was the last person left to ask. And I suppose with the Dalkey authors, he's trying to find somebody who's alive and you can talk to.
Oh,
It's that's hard enough. So I suppose here we are.
Well,
that is that
I'll
is true
shadow
enough.
that for
Yeah.
you. I'll say that it was my turn to pick a book, and because like Chad and I are doing the Irish books, or he's having me on to do the Irish books, and we're kind of going every other, we're getting to pick kind
Yeah.
of and taking turns. And I definitely picked Sleepwalker because I read the book. It's been at least 10 years or so probably since I read it, but I found it because I like Dalkey books, so I like Irish literature, so it just I kind of was going down the list. But when I saw it, I think it was at the AWP Book Fair when they were in Chicago, maybe. So that's going back a ways. And it was at the table. I'll be honest with you, like those two factors were one thing. The other is a little bit ridiculous because it's the only Dalkey book that's got a pink cover, which I thought was just a very
Yeah.
striking standout thing. So it caught the eye. But then I read it, and and I know this is something that, like, we can talk about a little later. We're kind of maybe jumping, but it did feel like it was very unlike, even the Doggy Irish books that I'd seen before, which were very much like Flann O'Brien and that kind of thing, which I do love. But I loved it. I remember reading it and being really surprised by how engrossing it was and how much I really just loved the book and connected with it, and most specifically with the writing. So I chose this as kind of like my first let's do Sleepwalker because I want to revisit it. It's been a while, and I want to see not just if it holds up, but like what my relationship to it is now that I'm 54 as opposed to I must have been 40 something when I read it. And I think a little closer maybe to the age of Stewart, where it's like, okay, I'm a little past where he was in his early 20s, starting his career, but I'm a late bloomer. So I still very much related to that idea of that inertia. And so now I wanted to see if I still felt it. And it resonated with me, I would say, in a different way, but we can get into
Yeah.
all that.
Well, great. Thanks, Vince, because I'm glad to do that. I was kind of reading it the same way, going, that's a long time ago, 20 years, and when I was writing it, I was already, a little bit past where Stewart would have been.
Right.
So I'm now considerably past where he was. So I was kind of interested to see how it would stand up for me, even as an individual, as the author of it, and never mind an audience. I was wondering, like, is this going to be terribly embarrassing? Or will there be little snippets of things where I go, yeah, like that's all right. I can live with that.
There's an author, a Spanish author, Javier Calvo, who he has a book, a novel called Wonderful World that was translated by his wife, Marafe Leatham. And I had read that book before I met him, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I saw him, and we were out drinking and hanging out, and I was like, he's very stern. He's got this big beard. He's very like serious and like very serious seeming. And I was like, I really love your novel. He's like, it is shit. And I was like, whoa, dude. I was like, it's pretty good. He's like, no, you read something you wrote 20 years ago and tell me it's not shit. I was like,
Yeah.
fair
Yeah,
point.
well, it's inevitable. You're
Fair
you're going
point.
to see the flaws because you know it so well. Like when you come back to it after all those years, like that's all still buried in there somewhere. So you're reading it and you're kind of you can anticipate where the sentence is going. You know it intimately, and then you start to see the flaws and the holes and the plot, and you start to see lots of things. At least that was my experience of reading it, say a week ago for the first time since I'd say 2007 or eight, maybe.
That's amazing. So I do want to talk about that because we've had on one of the other podcasts, the 2 Month Review, we talked to the co-host Brian Wood about his short story collection and him not that far removed, like I guess like 7 to 10 years removed from writing it and going
Yeah,
back and being like, here's what I would have done differently. Here's sort of like what his viewpoint was. And I found it very, very interesting as someone who's not a creative writer in this way, does not write fiction. So I do want to talk about that, but we really should be positive
yeah,
about the positive parts of the book first. And I guess a good place to start is how did this come to be? How did you come to be a novelist writer? And how did Dalkey end up picking up this book? This is one, just to preface that, this is one of three books that you've published with Dalkey. There's also Huddleston Road, which is the second, and then Slipping being the third one.
yeah.
And then you're
Um,
working on something new, which I will tease.
yes, yeah, yeah. That's like I feel a little bit worried about it. The new thing, I kind of have that, that Joyce thing where he said, why did he go to France? And he said because if he'd stayed home, he would have talked it instead of writing it. And a little bit like that, sometimes you have to not you can't if you talk the idea too much, you
Yeah.
can kill it.
Yeah.
But I'm delighted to like dip into it. But you
Okay.
know your way it is yourself. So look, as regards where did trying to write a book come from? There was a part of me that always wanted to do it,
Hmm.
but I wasn't a particularly great student. I did like English as I got older. I didn't when I was younger. Wasn't a great reader. And when I was about in high school, kind of end of that 16, 17, 18, I started to like it. I had a teacher, Terry Dunn, who I really liked, and he was quite morose and serious. And I didn't always understand what it was we were reading, but I looked at him and I wanted to know what is it that's making this man feel that way? And I was kind of interested and I enjoyed writing. And I still wasn't really like a great reader. But on the basis of that, then I went and did an English degree in London. And then I suppose since then, I would like while still a slow reader, I'm catching up on all. People tell me they've read lots of things. I read quite slowly, and I don't have the background of I've read since I was 5 or 6 years old and that kind of thing. So, loads of people say to me, "Have you read such and such?" And I go, "I don't even know who they are." But I kind of find one book to another. So, but then ever since then, I'm always reading something, and I had this inkling, I suppose, to want to write a book. I never spoke about it, and then it was coming into a summertime, and I'm a teacher, and I had time off. At the time, I was teaching in a primary school and stuff like that. So I did 5 years there, and I kind of got it in my head I wanted to use the summer to start trying to write a book. I'd returned from London to Dublin, and I had a sense of a place that had really changed in the 5 years since I was in London. It's Celtic Tiger. I was about 3 years behind everybody else, and I went to college in 21 as opposed to straight out of school. And I felt the place has changed, and I was observing these things. I felt that it was something I wanted to write, and I still couldn't really do it. It wasn't working, and because I tried to squirrel myself away and do this, I didn't really want to talk about it. And then my girlfriend, now my wife at the time, I said to her, I'm writing a book and I want to try and use the summer to write a book. And that was the first time I said it out loud to anybody.
Right.
And then I kind of felt like, shit, I better produce something now. I'm kind of, because otherwise I'm just sitting around the house all summer doing nothing. So that was the kind of an impetus to move it. And I would say over the next sort of 2 summers, the bulk of the book was kind of written. And I found it easy enough to edit. I was very surprised to find that I actually love editing. I love working on the text. I find it really hard to sit down and get the fella from one end of the street to the next in the actual writing. But actually, once that's down, that's fine. It's like the block of wood that I'm going to start chiseling now. So I enjoyed that part. So I could do that part during term time, but I felt like I really needed space ahead of me to write kind of creatively. And so anyway, I did that, and nobody had read it, kept it to myself, wouldn't let anybody near it. And when I felt I had a fairly good draft done, I sent it out various places, and the usual thing, everyone said no. A lot of people came back, and the most common thing was, we don't know what to do with this. We don't know how we'd market it. And I was going, right, okay, fair enough. And then Somerville Press in Bantry in County Cork, and Andrew and Jane Russell, who become kind of good friends of mine, I sent it to Andrew, and Andrew actually got back to me and he said, I was on the way to Croatia with a friend of mine and his girlfriend and my now wife, my girlfriend. We were going away, and I gave her the manuscript. I said, you can read it. And I sat petrified as she was reading it. But she kept laughing, and I went, okay, that's good. That's good. But the last place I sent it was to Somerville Press, or to Andrew Russell. He was down as an agent. And I went away thinking, oh, look, that's the last one. Literally, I'm not kind of sending that anywhere. And then I got an email from him telling me that, look, he's not really that kind of a publisher, but that himself and Jane are opening up their own publishing house. He was more of an agent for bigger publishers trying to find them writers and things like that. But he said he wouldn't mind using the book as one of their first ones to try and kind of launch it. I said, okay, brilliant. And so that's how it came into being. But then Andrew, because of his other job representing different kind of publishers and distributors, came in contact with John O'Brien. And he said, I'm going to I'll send this book to him to see what he thinks. So it was published here and in the UK first under Somerville Press. And so it had already been published by the time Andrew sent it to John. And that's how Dalkey that's how it got in front of Dalkey.
Interesting. And then you worked with John more closely after that, right?
Well, it was a good while now. So what happened there was I met John. I was actually out in Dalkey village having dinner with my wife and some friends. And Andrew rang me and says, oh, John O'Brien's here in Dublin. I'm going to say with Martin Riker.
Yep.
Riker? Yeah. Yep. And they were there, and they were in the city centre, and I was Dalkey. And he said he'd really like to talk to you about the book. And I said, oh, Bridget and I so had to say, is it all right if I leave this dinner that we've arranged and it's taken us a month to get to? And so anyway, everybody was kind of supportive of that. And then Andrew said, just one other thing. He said, he wouldn't mind seeing, he said, you got something else, that you got a draft of that. So I ran home to my parents' house where there was a copy, and got in a taxi, got into town. And so met John and Martin and Andrew, and we sat down. And he said, look, I really like the book. We'd like to do it. Are you interested? And I said, yeah. And he asked me, was I writing anything else? And because he obviously he knew. And I said, yeah, I'll have that there. And he took that, and he took about 2 minutes, look at the first 2 pages. He said, yeah, we'll do that too. And I went, okay, way. Right. Yeah. I said, right. Okay. So when I started working for him then was further down the line. So that's one of the things, because I did, I question when I was going out trying to talk about the book and being a Dalkey author, people going, well, he works for them. So I questioned my own credibility, but I suppose what makes me feel better about that is that he took the first 2 before we had that relationship. So that came there somewhere between Huddleston Road and Slipping. I would say about 2015, maybe.
Hmm.
And again, how did that happen? Well, I came to him said looking for a bit of extra work myself. I needed a bit, and he said, "I have something bigger for you if you want." And I went, "Oh, I'm not sure what this is." And
That sounds like a John statement for sure.
yeah, and I said, "Well, yeah," and I said, "God, but I couldn't afford to say no." So yeah, okay, let's do that. And then he was talking to me at the time. It was really a sales thing. Now, anybody who knows me would say I can't imagine somebody worse to be a salesperson. So I went like it couldn't sell anything. Like I'm just terrible at it anyway. But as it happened, I went to one of the first bookshops I went into. It was a really brilliant bookshop in Dublin called
Uh-huh.
Books Upstairs, right? And I went in, and your man said, "Oh, great, we've been trying to get loads of these books, but they're very hard to find. We can't get them. We can't source them." And I came out, and he bought 150 books. I had the catalog with me, and he had bought 100 and 150 books. And I came out and went, now, it was pure fluke that I went into that shop, and that's the kind of shop it was, and they were looking for it, but they were buying French, Estonian stuff and all sorts of things, and there were specific things they were looking for that they couldn't get anywhere else, and that sort of thing. So that made me look, like I knew what I was doing. There
Yeah.
wasn't very many, but and aside from that, then I started just going around, kind of making connections with people. But then, as time went on, and various people moved in and out of Dalkey, as I realized was a kind of a pattern, I kind of more things kind of came to me to do, and I was doing, you know, I was turning up at events. I was then trying to with Chris DeVoe, who was working there at the time as well. We were trying to work out the problems with distribution, and
Yeah.
I think we actually knew what it was. We had it figured out, and we had a way to do it. We talked to other small publishers in Dublin, and they told us. Uh, but I suppose things at that Sean wasn't well, and things are a little bit chaotic, and we never ultimately we never got to grips with that in that period once they left Norton, I think.
Yeah. 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 That makes sense. That's actually still a problem, to be honest. Like with
Yeah.
the distributor that they had in the US when John passed away and the distributor that we have now. I don't want to slander or get myself sued, but the distribution overseas, particularly in Ireland, is almost non-existent through their
Yeah, but
system.
the only thing I'd say is that, like, for the first time in years, I know because in there it might have been say 2 Christmases ago. I was in town in Books Upstairs actually with my daughter, and she went, "Oh, there's your book." Yeah, and I went, "Okay, Jesus, look at that," And so it seems to be you can't order it, you can't get your hands on it if you want, which wasn't the case, you know, in 2017 when Slipping came out, and it had won this small independent publisher award in the UK, the Rubery Award for fiction,
Mhm.
but it won the award, but nobody could get the book.
Oh God.
And I was going, and I was on my way that morning to Berkeley to the Bay Area Book Festival
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I'd been invited over, and so I was heading over to that, and I got this news that I'd won this award. Chris DeVoe, who's working there at Dalkey, had sent me a text. "Have you seen that?" And I went, "Oh, geez, no, I hadn't." And I looked at it, and then of course, book wasn't. Nobody could get their hands on it.
God, that's
So
so unfortunate.
yeah, so it was look, those are parts of it at the moment, and I knew that too. But I knew there was all those problems were there when it was coming out. I thought that we might be able to fix them, but and we could have, I think, if we'd been given the right support, but it just didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And other authors suffered the same thing. Like we had a launch for, yeah, Eilish Nguivna, who had a book of stories that John asked her to write, and we had a launch with no books. And I had to turn up and try and explain that. And I'd signaled it like 3, 4 weeks beforehand. I said, "This is like what I would like to have these 2 weeks in advance. I want to see these in the." And then at that point, I remember saying to him, "I'm not doing another one unless I can see the books. I'm not agreeing to it.
Yeah.
I want books there." Um, but it was all so much at that point,
Yeah.
and he wasn't well, and
No.
it was hard to stay on top of it.
And then like that's the Irish element of Dalkey's history is one that's very vague to me. I only know kind of the outlines. I know that he always wanted to have a location or an office there.
Yeah,
Got that set up, was like very, very connected from what I know, and then had the health issues, and then everything kind of fell apart from what I understand.
yeah. And
Um,
that's and the health issues is really where I came into it. To be honest, like
oh, okay.
that was in a sense that we had known each other, and we did every time he was around, we'd meet for pizza and stuff like that, and we'd go out, and we were quite
100%
friendly.
the pizza.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I still tell people I know with wonder. of sitting across from John as he sprinkled salt on pizza.
Oh
And I was
God.
going, oh my God, what's going on here? But anyway, he did it all the time. So we used to meet for pizza. So then, as a result of that, we became friendly.
Yeah.
And then, then he kind of brought me in to do different bits and pieces with kind of Dalkey. But when he got sick, I knew he was going into hospital.
Yeah.
And I knew he'd had cardiac issues because I've had 3 aortic valve replacements myself, and that was one of the things we kind of bonded over. We're going, okay, well,
Right.
we both kind of know that, right? And he'd gone into the hospital, the Beacon Hospital, which is quite close to me now here, and I knew he was going in for some sort of test. And I hadn't heard from him, and nobody had heard from him. And then some of the people in the office were contacting me and said, "We haven't got in contact with John. We're not sure where he is." And then they were able to find him, but they weren't family, so they couldn't get into him. And I went up to the hospital then one evening, and he was in urgent kind of cardiac care. And I just kind of waited for the door to open. And I slipped in. And when I got there, and I knew this, as soon as I was stopped, I was going to be kicked out. But I got to the nurse's station, and I could see over their shoulders his room, and I could see him. So I got there and I said, look, I know that man, and I think he's no family here at all. And I'm not sure they know he's here.
Oh my God.
So can I go and talk to him, please? And he was very agitated. And I went in and he was, but I think from he was actually not in his right mind. He was seeing things and hallucinating. And I went in, and I remember sitting there, and he had the phone. He was trying to get it out, and I think it was Kathleen on the phone.
Oh yeah.
Is that his
Yeah.
daughter's name,
Yeah,
Kathleen?
that's his daughter. Yep.
Yeah, and I think I spoke there, and I was in there, and I sat with him for a while. I remember that, and I think actually because the Irish Times asked me to write a kind of something about him when he died. I think this is in that. The best title I've ever had, which was the article was "Staring Down the Barrel" with John O'Brien.
Oh
And,
my God.
and it's funny because I'd written the headline. I kept it because I was going, something's going to happen to him in a couple of years, and I kept it, and I went, so that's perfect. But I talked to her, and I sat with him for a while, and I was kind of remember sitting there. I was kind of holding his hand at one point, and I said, "No, I'll talk." And I talked to them and explained, "Look, this is what's happened, and he's okay, and this whatever." And then I suppose I was in and out to him then
Yeah.
over the next kind of few weeks until he went back to the premises they had in Fitzwilliam Square, and the big hospital bed went with him. But he really was incredibly sick at that point. And I think when I came looking to him for work, I think he wrongly needed. I think he felt in a way indebted,
Oh.
and I think so. And like I didn't want him to feel like that's not what that wasn't what it was about. But I think he always that was something that was with him there. And he always remembered I went in one evening with my son Oscar, he was my eldest, who was maybe 7 at the time. He had a big shock of blonde hair, and he had a pocket full of stones. Kids, 7-year-old
Yeah.
stones when you got in your pocket. And John was always remembered him. And every time we meet, he would ask how's Oscar, like long after Oscar was long grown out of that. He would ask how he is. And he took him over to his house, and there was loads of these marble stones at the back. And he said, "Help yourself, you just ask to take them off." So that's how it started, I suppose. And so we got to know each other very well that way, and then working for him. And I suppose that was it was never. It would be an exaggeration. It was never a test of the friendship, and my relationship with him as an employee was not the same as everyone else's.
Mm-hmm.
There was one early stage where he fired me off a kind of an email that I didn't like the sound of. And I just sat back and I went to bed, and I said, I'm not going to do this now. But I said, this is a defining kind of moment, and I need to either push back or it's going to be like everybody else. And I did, but gently and diplomatically.
Yeah. Yeah.
I said, I did this because you told me that, and I did that because you told me this. Now, those seemed to me at the time contradictory things, and I asked you, and you said that's what you wanted to do. And I don't know whether it was that or the friendship that was the difference in the working relationship, but it was one of those things where I said, this is going to define how we work together here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure there's echoes there for you that you understand that yourself. He did always say, actually, he said there was 2 people, and you were one of them. I can't remember who the other one was. He said there was only 2 people I thought could run the press, and Chad was one of them, and then he left.
Yep.
It's
Well,
it,
we're not doing that now, so we'll see. We'll see how that goes.
it's funny because the place where I work, my suite mate in the office used to work for Dalkey. He went to the University of Illinois, and he just worked as a student. So Chad, you probably know more about this, obviously. And he really liked John, but he's like, I figured out after about a week that the way to succeed here, which just meant like finish my internship or whatever I was doing, was to learn what not to say.
Yep.
Like it's more about like navigating this kind of minefield, and if I can do that and be very front of mind what the next thing I'm going to say is and how I'm going to frame it, like I think I'll be okay.
Yeah. Well, he
So
used to say to me as well, it's like, I just need somebody who can read my mind.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
an old yes, that was an old trope,
Yeah.
100%. I forgot about
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Never mention a wedding. Do not ever mention a wedding.
No, yeah. There's no, or bank holidays.
Oh
He
yeah.
loves bank
Oh yeah.
holidays.
No such thing. No such thing. That's really interesting. I want to get into the book itself in a second, but I do have one
Yes.
last question because you brought this up sort of beforehand that you had done with for Traffic of Europe, a conversation with John some years ago, in which you talked
Yeah.
about the Eileen Battersby book, which we just talked about, Teeth Marks on My Tongue.
Yes.
So I'm curious, like, what your reaction was to that book and what how that conversation went because it seems Vince and I talked about it beforehand of like before we got on that podcast that we recorded of that it doesn't seem much like a Delkey book per se because it's not experimental. It's not playing with a lot of, it seems very straightforward. Although I think by the end of our podcast, we were very much convinced that it was doing a lot more than we had initially seen. But I'm curious
Yeah.
what your thoughts were on this and what your
Uh,
relationship.
a little bit like yourself. I actually quite liked it. I thought it was a good book and I liked it and I enjoyed it and I wanted to read it. John and her came into contact because of the strength of her writing as a reviewer, and when she got herself into bits of trouble with some harsh reviews,
Mhm.
particularly of a couple of Irish authors, and then she was moved off that, and she was very kind of frustrated about that. But I knew nothing about her. I knew her work, and actually I used to read her reviews, every Saturday in the Irish Times. I would read it, but I knew nothing more of her than that. And then there was a kind of a party that John was having at the house, trying to bring various people together, and I was introduced to her that day, and I got chatting to her. And she was, she was quite erratic, and she was but she was intense, which was really interesting person. And she knew so much about literature, and she was so smart and so intelligent. And I assumed that like the strength of that was why maybe John came to the book, but they also had a really kind of good friendship. And now they fell out, and then they kind of came back together again. And and it was around the dogs and things like that, and stuff like that, and animals. And Eileen was big into that. And so I maybe met her in person 3 times, and I'd say maybe I spoke to her maybe 20 times in that short 2 years between me meeting her there and her death when she died so tragically.
Yeah.
And anybody who, I've said this before, anybody who knows Eileen uh, would know that I can say pretty precisely that I then spoke to her, apart from the times I met her for 20 hours, because no phone call was ever shorter than an hour. And they all ended almost on the button, on the arrow, I have to go. But you couldn't get away, and you couldn't get away from them, and she could be ringing you up to ask about the book. She could be ringing you up just to tell you about one of the horses.
Oh,
Um, and that would go into all sorts of different things. And I found her very endearing. I know, I think other people maybe who worked with her, you hear things kind of found her kind of frustrating and sometimes difficult. I'd say herself and John were like not too dissimilar. And
yeah.
he was very fond. He was very fond of her, and he made great efforts to when that broke down to fix it
Right. Right.
because I think she was important. So, but is it a dog? I know what you mean. I wouldn't have thought so. No, but I think that's quite surprising because of the kind of critical stuff she was writing. I think
Mhm.
he might. I think maybe he would even have expected it to be, something different to that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah. But I liked it. I enjoyed it.
I did too. It's interesting. I think I mentioned this on the podcast, but I just wrote a introduction to a book by Louis Paul Bone that's Chapel Road that talks about like what makes a Delkey book.
Yeah.
And one of John's things phrases was always like if we publish it.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's therefore it is. Like it's
Yeah.
which is, facetious, but at the same time,
Yeah.
like, yeah.
and that's what he said. When we were talking about that, like as I said on the podcast, I was on there before I had with John. That was it. And on that part, he'd never told me this before. He told me on the podcast. He said, "Well, did I ever tell you how we came to publish it?" And I said, "No, I've no idea." He said, "Look, I was sent this thing over, and I was getting into a car. Now, I may have my geography wrong. You can tell me if I'm correct. I think he was saying he was going from Champagne to Illinois or something like this. And he said in the car, and he said, I got in the book, and he said, there was a guy in the front, and he said, I kept laughing. He kept asking me what I was laughing at. And he said, by the end of the car journey, I said, we're doing this one. We're
Wow.
going to do that. Yeah. And I said, okay, that's kind of nice to hear that I was. And he said, point being, what you're saying is a Dalkey book is one that I think is worth publishing.
Yep.
And that's kind of it. So that there is that part. I just look at mine and I see it sitting in among, all those kind of names. And even as a teacher, we had a group of Dalkey authors, all authors in translation, into my school once to do like a panel thing with the kids, and the kids read the book. We had the books in 2-3 weeks in advance of John, and they read them, and they had questions for them. And we had a French teacher from the French department, and we had sort of so we had these kind of different books. They were all French in this particular panel. And we brought those kind of people in, and I was looking. These kind of books are so experimental. Like that to me was the Dalkey book,
Right.
and I was going, I don't know where I fit in there. Look, and I was delighted to be there, but I'm just glad that when he took it, we didn't know each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because otherwise I could have, because I would have felt differently about it.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Vince, I've been asking
I've
a lot.
actually been, if I may. Oh no, I was just thinking. Sorry, yeah, I'm thinking a lot about this from our last conversation, like what makes a Dalkey book, and I know that is kind of the refrain of like, well, it's really not any one thing, and if readers are imposing this idea of a Dalkey book on Dalkey books, that's not necessarily true to whatever Dalkey itself was supposed to be in John O'Brien's mind, or now in your mind. But what's sort of fascinating is if I can get for 2 seconds mildly literary theorist mode for a second, and I'm not like the most steeped in literary theory. But when I was always writing my papers in grad school, I was always thinking about reader response criticism being the one that's maybe the most interesting to me, because it kind of gives, this is my bad nutshell, it gives the reader a little more agency. Like the books is just a book that an author makes, but it doesn't really become a book until the reader co-creates it through the act of reading. Otherwise, it's just pages and ink. So I've always liked that because it kind of gave a little bit less credence to like, this is what the author intended, and this is the idea that you must have, and it's more interpretation is a little bit more woven into that theory. So I was thinking about the one thing that maybe for all my Dalkey book experiences that I could say is a uniform experience for me is I have to do a lot of work when I'm reading these books, which is not a bad thing. It sounds bad, but you do have, Dalkey books ask something of you, which is you meet with them where they are, and you either accept or reject that. And that's kind of what reader response criticism is formed on as well. So in a sense, if I'm thinking the weirdest Dalkey book I could think of might be something like that book Lava, or is it Lava? That
Larva?
one
Yeah.
by this. Yeah, like I didn't finish it, but it's amazing.
Yeah.
So you have a book that's fat, it's this thick, and it's doing a lot of experimental things with the actual text versus say, Sleepwalker. Like they're not necessarily akin in that regard, but one of the things I'll say about Sleepwalker, which is I'm wading into dangerous territory as I start imposing my interpretations on the book that may not be your intention, John, but there is a lot of things I was reading this time where I'm like, this is what he meant. This is what this is supposed to be. This is symbolic of this. And I'm guessing, no, it's just me sort of doing that thing where I'm meeting this book in a way where my interpretive hat is on. And it may be because it's a Dalkey book and I'm thinking that this is what it's supposed to do. But I think a lot of the things that I'm having with all the Dalkey books, however, like experimental or quote unquote traditional, is I do find myself kind of bringing something to them that is a little bit more interpretive on my end, that perhaps is one of the things that unites a lot of these books, is they're very active. You have to be actively engaged in a way that I don't know every book is going to ask you to be. So even this one, I have like my notes I'm looking at, I'm like, I bet you that's just me reading something that's not there. And we can even discuss that, but that might just be possibly a unifying thing, if that makes sense. Chad, I don't know. Does that sound like ridiculous to you?
No, that totally makes sense. I was thinking too that one of John's frequent refrains was that a good book has a real character, that books are about creating character. in a way, and like through the experimentation through other things, it's creation of like a consciousness, and that not only is there a consciousness within the book, but the book itself has a sort of like consciousness of how it's written. And I think that this book fits into that very well through like the structure, which is I was gonna say unique. I don't know if unique's the right word, but like the way that it's broken up by the days with the one flashback, but everything's like the morning, the afternoon, or the morning, the evening, and you move through these days in that pattern that constructs it, and that the book has this kind of non-movement movement that's there of like that constant like he's not gonna go to work. Like we all know that like right away,
Yeah.
not going back to work. Not gonna happen. But yet, like it does have to move him as a character from this beginning point where he wakes up and doesn't remember the night before, which I think is really interesting, through to the end where he has to like make a decision that will alter his life. And then the other thing that I think was really, when you're talking about the active reader, that I think is really interesting is that the book does posit that there's the narrator named Tom who is telling this story about Stuart. That adds that layer when you're reading it and engaging with it that you're not into that like Victorian like this omniscient narrator telling you what's happening, but there is a person relating this and that pops up every so often. And I feel like that's one of those moments where like as a reader you're not challenged might be the wrong word, but you're given this thing to like interact with. Like do you see this now as like this other character that's narrating it? What does that sort of mean or shift your reading a little bit? And I think that that's really interesting. But also, John just loved things that were fun and funny. Like in the end, like
Hmm.
anything that was funny,
Yeah.
it's a good pass. And the book is does have this like not slapstick humor, but has this humor, this base, this like light, fun vibe to it. And that really would appeal to him, like in a way that like we can't discount. Where I do think like we've brought this up a bunch of times, but I think there are a lot of readers that are like Dalkey books are like Larva, big, hard, difficult, challenging. And yet at the same time, there's so many that are just like, yeah, this made me laugh. Like I'm trying to write this thing this week about Cano, Raymond Cano, and I remember specifically with Odile, John saying we decided to publish Odile because I read the first paragraph, and if I remember right, it's about like a puddle, and he's like, I just like that first paragraph, so I decided we just publish him. The end.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny that you say about the comedy there, because and I think it's funny too, and I think it is. It's really in many ways it is a comedy.
Yeah.
But when I was writing it first in the first draft, like I was very earnest. This is going to be a commentary on yeah on society and all the rest. And it was very serious. And it was only in the editing that I went, I can't, not even I can take this fellow seriously.
Yeah.
This actually, and so it became comic in the editing. I started realizing that this is actually this fellow is so self indulgent that this cannot be anything other than a comedy. But that only emerged for me in the actual editing. I thought before that it was all very, furrowed brow, earnest young man kind of stuff, and I realized my own ridiculousness as I went to edit it. I went, okay, no, that's not what this is at all. And I do, and like my own feelings, I do think that those are often the bits that work best in the book are the comic parts.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like that sort of thing. Like, do it sounds a bit artsy, to go too far, but you kind of discover what your voice is, and like I was saying to you guys just before we started, is it like I knew nothing about writing. I had no idea how to write a book, how to even lay out a manuscript. I knew nothing. I was learning even the very basics of, because I wasn't a wonderful student or anything. I was interested and I was okay, but like even about kind of laying punctuation. I was going, how do I do it? Like, what's my thing? How do I handle this sentence? And kind of I'm trying to create a way of working and a way of managing that voice so that it's consistent. And I was learning it all on the spot. And so, like, I poured everything I had into it. I know that doesn't mean that it's the work of art or perfect, but it was right there at that point in my life. That was everything I had.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I'm very proud of it because it represents something I gave everything to. And, yourselves, you don't do that very often in your life, yeah. And that's so I'm very proud of it, but I know its flaws and its weaknesses as well.
I think that leaving it all on the field that way is really key too, and you can pick up on that, like with certain books that someone's like giving it their all, and it works as it does, and like that is like an admirable thing and something that is very appealing, even if it's like sort of subconscious. I think like the part where it's the guy's name, Eamon What's the
Eamon Quigley, is it?
Is it
Quigley?
Quigley? Yeah,
Yeah.
Quigley. I was
Quigley.
going to talk
I
about
was
that. Yeah.
so
That
yeah.
scene in the bar is where like that really starts to play with this. That where you're talking about like the seriousness versus the sort of humor.
Yes.
That part, like his whole speech about like, here's like looking at the modern world. You have nothing. We don't have
Yes.
anything
Yeah.
to believe in. There's like you're doing a job that's pointless. All this kind of stuff. That could be very heavy. But the fact that it's set in this pub and he's getting increasingly wasted and making
Yeah.
less that's like
Yeah.
that perfect sort of
Yeah.
undercut and again
Yeah.
very Irish humor to like, yeah.
Yeah.
You got all these great ideas,
Somebody
but
somebody did say to me that the Trinity College aren't going to like this representation of their student body. I said, well, I write what I see.
yes, I really love it.
Yeah, the Quigley chapter always stood out for me. Like I remember two things about this book from my first reading. It was that whole sequence, and the last paragraph like really kind of struck me as being like a really almost it's really hard to stick the landing, and it's just such a perfect like it's really the synecdoche of the book. It sums it all up to perfectly, and it does have a kind of like it's funny in a sense that whole ending scene in the airport where Tom and him kind of wrap up, and he's been telling them the story the whole time. But it feels like editing is clearly something you were attentive to because you can over edit to the point where something gets really unwieldy as a piece of prose, and you can tell it's been like shop worn and polished. And you can also sometimes tell when things are very raw and a little maybe too raw and could use some punching up. But like tonally, I thought like you really nailed the ending. So I remember when I
Yeah.
read the book the first time, that's one of the like three books where I'm like the ending of this book really is what's made this if almost solidified in my head as like a book I will keep and return to at some point.
Yeah. Well, so thanks, Vince. That's very nice. My my brother-in-law who read it said something very similar about it. Said like he was reading the book, going, "Why am I reading about this brick here? I don't understand." But and then he said, "But then those last," and I think he was talking about it, kind of a 7 or 8 pages. He went, and that just kind of brought it home as one of the things. Like I've been mentioning the things that I'm not very good at. One of the things I think in the three books that I am quite good at, and I am very attentive to, is endings. You know, and sometimes my problem is just getting the rest of the book down so I can do the ending. Uh, because I feel like that, and I do work on it, and one of the things that I like myself is the ending. I do like the pace of it and the flow of it, and uh, not to be Jesus, I don't want to be, because obviously I'm not comparing myself with anybody, but one of the books I read, and as cliched as it is The Great Gatsby.
Mhm.
And I love this. It's the flow of the ending,
Yeah.
and I just love it. And I've read it and reread it so many times, and that kind of finding that pace of that you're giving them a little bit and then holding it back and giving a little bit and then boom, you get to it. And I do think the three books end well.
Yeah. That's really interesting. There's that Marcel Benabou book, like, oh God, what's it called? Like the books I have not written. It's something like that. Or you should do like a version of that where it's like the endings to the books I never wrote sort of thing,
Yeah.
where it's just the endings of like 20
Well,
or 30
it's
different
actually
novels.
it's kind of like that with what I'm doing at the moment. Like I have the ending, I go, I know that's the ending. And somebody was asking me about a year ago, you finished? I think I wrote the ending to something, and he said, "Oh, so you're finished?" Not really,
It's the I'm
because
beginning.
I haven't written the middle.
Yeah, that's
But
always that's like classic creative writing workshop advice is like have an ending and then you write towards it and then you're pretty much set. But it's not as
yeah,
easy as if it was as easy as that, I would have like 50 books written at this point. Yeah.
yeah, and everything
So,
shifts in it. But then the other thing you hear in creative, like well, I've heard it loads of times. You certainly hear it in, secondary school, high school, kind of English classes. Is you make a plan, you plan your story. I've never planned a story ever in my life, because
nope.
you have to feel your way into it. I don't know where this is going. I have some sort of feeling that I'm trying to evoke, and I'm not sure how I'm going to get there.
Yeah.
And then it takes funny turns. You're halfway through a sentence and you make a typo, but you go, oh, hang on a second, there's something in that, and you change course again, and yeah, that's it. So, or as it was, I think, years ago, I read an interview with Edge from U2 saying, that they go into the studio to make the same album every time, but you never make it. So you keep coming back, and so there's the ideal novel that's there for you,
Yeah.
But you just never get there. You circle it and probe it, and you get closer sometimes than you were before, but you're never going to actually do it. But I think that's the thing that keeps you coming back.
I don't want to spoil
So,
the ending
oh,
or spoil like the plot point of this because I think anyone listening to this should just read the book because you do get held in suspense as to how this will play out, like right up until the end. But I do have to say, like echoing what you said, Vince, the ending is so remarkable. And like as a plot design, I absolutely loved it. And it's interesting because I got to read or work on two books in a row that did this, where there's a book that's coming out in February called The City by Lara Moreno. I finished editing that and like immediately texted the translator. I was like, "This is the best ending that could possibly be for it. This is absolutely perfect." And I finished this. I was like, "Fuck yeah, this ending is
Yeah,
absolutely perfect." Like these are like that's so rare.
great.
Like you
This is
say,
a
it's
victory for
very
me. That's
rare.
good. Thank you. You're both very kind. Thank you.
So many endings are just awful, and like this really did
yeah.
so well, and like does pay off in so many ways, and like makes it very very interesting. Also feels like this is a world that you could spin out in a way, which is
Mm.
which I don't know if you have any ideas or plans on, but it does feel like something that's like part of a larger universe of sorts.
Yeah. Well, two things was one. There was a moment where I had written the narrator Tom into the one I'm working at the moment.
Ah,
And
interesting.
I've backpedaled a little bit, but I did have a section where it was in. I went, no, I'm going to come away from this for a second. But it was kind of like it was. So yeah, so maybe it's not all dead. And but of course, that's just I suppose that's my Philip Roth obsession kind of coming through here.
Yeah.
Where where yeah, we have these characters turning up repeatedly in other people's stories and messing them up.
Yeah, it's very true.
Yeah.
Very true. Were there any influences? I know you said you hadn't read a lot, your background and are a slow reader. Were there any influences on your writing so far?
Although there's everything is an influence that I read. Like and now, like I say, I'm reading all the time. It's just I started so comparatively late, and I read kind of slowly and stuff like that. But certainly when I was writing this, and you mentioned the structure earlier, and I feel that I lifted that from the English writer Martin Amis. I think
Oh
like
yeah.
I think I lifted that from the Rachel papers. I looked at that and I
Hmm.
went, look at the way that's structured. So although that all happens in one night,
Yeah.
mine was over a week, and I saw in that a vehicle, a way to contain the story so it didn't get sprawling and get out of my control. And starting as a first time kind of author, knowing nothing, that seemed to me a good thing to do, to kind of put the brakes on myself a little bit. So like those were, but at those times, it was all the people I read on my degree that I liked. There were influences like, so there was, I was reading lots of Salman Rushdie at the time, and there was Julian Barnes, but then there was, E.L. Doctorow, Don DeLillo, and there's all of these as well, and I started reading kind of Roth at that time as well. And there was all of those kind of people were floating around in there. And then I suppose through that English degree as well, like I'm trying to think, like there was bits of Margaret Atwood, and
Oh yeah.
I did a sci-fi module because of Ursula K. Le Guin and stuff like that, and I found that sort of stuff really where you're extrapolating into a future. I thought that was really kind of interesting, and there was all sorts of things going on. But in terms of this book, I suppose it was more those those kind of modern British, modern US writers were really the influence. If there's influences now, I don't think I'm like them in any way. Like I write nothing like the books that I enjoy reading.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and like the best example I can think of that is I absolutely and I only started reading her. I'd say about 5 years ago. Like I knew she was, but Joan Didion.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And I just am blown away. But one of the things I'm blown away is that I literally never know what she's going to do.
Right.
I don't know where a sentence is going. I cannot understand how she writes or what she does. But every time I do it, you come away going, that is just something I couldn't do. That
Hmm.
whatever is going on in her head is just beyond me. But I love it.
Yeah.
And I just can't get my head around what she's doing. And it's totally, to me, just so unlike anybody else.
Yeah.
And when I read, that's what I want. I want to read something that I go, that's different, right? And I don't mind it being simple. I don't mind it being complicated, but it has to be something kind of different.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and I think another great example was myself and John once had a conversation. He gave it to me. I don't know whether you've read it. Was Nicholas Mosley's Impossible Object.
Oh, my favorite.
Man, I loved it. And
Isn't it amazing?
somebody asked me what's it about. What's going to say? I haven't a clue.
No idea.
Haven't a clue. John said one
No
time
idea.
that Mosley, John went to try and explain to Nicholas how John understood what went on, and he had to kind of said he said he drew out a map for him, and he had all of this, and Mosley he just shrugged his shoulders and said, "I'm not sure."
Yeah, that's
you
right.
know, but I read it, but it was just absolutely mind blowing, and I was going, that is that's just brilliant. Yeah,
Incredible book.
yeah.
Incredible. And
So yeah,
Yeah,
look,
I just read that about I just read that a few months ago and I'm still trying to figure that one out exactly. And
yeah,
it's not even a
yeah,
book that's that complex to get through as far as any stylistic things. It's just
yeah, yeah.
I'm thrown for
But
a loop on the entire thing.
but Vince, a little bit like what you were saying about what the Dalkey books are, what might unify them, stuff like that. It was one of those things where you go, I just accept that I don't understand all of this,
mhm.
Mhm.
and I'm going to see how it makes me feel.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah,
went
that's
right, and it was really like it was something that Impossible Object. It's got some really profound and tender moments, and you go, and this is just I don't. Basically people have to read it.
Yeah.
You can't explain it.
It's an experience. We're
Yeah.
actually, I'm starting, I have it here to work on the reissues of the Catastrophe Practice series, starting with
Okay.
Monsters, which is the other, like that
Yes.
Impossible Object are kind of the twin towers of his like,
Yeah. Yeah.
reputation. I don't know if you can say twin towers anymore without RIP, but never forget.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are like his major, major, major works. And I love his writing, I love his books, and they are exactly what you say. Like you just kind of experience, you're like, wow, this is making me feel all these things, making me think all these things. These are really interesting ideas. I don't know where this is going or how this works at all.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No,
that's
brilliant. So
maybe like
because
oh no, that
fire away, Vince.
oh it's on me now. Sorry. That's maybe something about like all the Dalkey books. That's why it's maybe the perfect one in a sense. Is like I think surrendering to the text is how I always put it. I just have to do that because I'm always sort of. I think I was trained as a young student to you must understand this and you must absolutely master it in a way that feels like it's the reader must have a sense of control. And I think surrendering to the text is part of the experience of meeting the text where it is. And that's why
Mhm.
I'm a little forgiving of a lot of books that, that maybe I think either I shouldn't be or some people I know might not be.
Yeah.
Same with any other work of art that I don't 100% have my head around. But yet, if there's something going on that's captivating or interesting, I'm fine with that. Even like I like kind of the feeling of not knowing or being a little uncertain. And my students are really grappling with that lately because I'm giving them some weird text this last semester. And a lot of the complaints where I just don't know that, like, I don't know if I understand it. And I feel really insecure about the fact that I don't understand it. I'm like, you're not supposed to, let's just give up on understanding. Let's just not talk about that. It's a really hard thing to do. And I think it is just education forces you to think about mastering a text versus surrendering to it. And even
Yeah.
in like Sleepwalker, like there's moments that I'm confident that I have a very clean interpretation of, but at the same time, that's always a feeling of like, maybe not, maybe I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wish everybody would read like that in a way. Just and I listen to the anti-literary criticism kind of thing, but I kind of in a way just read it and just see what happens. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, and we kind of glorious that people kind of did that. And I think when you do that, you can find that you can take your experimental kind of literature, and you can take Sleepwalker, and you can go, I can take something from both of them.
Hmm.
But it doesn't have to be. But you would like people to kind of read that way all the time. And sometimes I wonder as well because I've read books that when I was younger and on my degree, and I remember not really liking them, and then I've come back and read them 20 years later, and I went, geez, I love that you
Yeah.
know. And sometimes it's about the space you're in, and not just age, but sometimes your head's just not really in the right place to be reading a certain kind of book.
Yep. You got to get the right book at the right time.
Yeah,
Absolutely. It's like it can be paralyzing when you have so many books to read and you're like, which is the one I should be reading right now? But generally speaking, I feel like that's a very true point that
yeah.
makes such a difference. So in terms of like going back to reread it, and you mentioned like there are things that you saw as like quote unquote flaws or things that you would change. What did you hone in on? And what have you learned as a writer since you wrote this? So that looking back, you're like, oh, I do that different now. I know more now.
It was, I suppose, the cardinal sin is uh, there's too much telling and not enough showing,
Uh,
and it definitely that was in the more literary highbrow kind of journals and reviews. That is something that came up a few times. Now
oh,
I think all of my books are guilty a little bit of that. But I was probably at my height of it in the first one. I was at peak show, and in a way, I could see, because it was the first time I'd written a book, and I've done this English degree, so I have a degree of knowledge about literature and analysis and stuff like that. I felt now when I read it like I was literally trying to do everything, every little trick and technique I'd read about or heard about. I was trying to squeeze it all in to the book. And I kind of see that now as well, like even the names of the cars and the CD players and stuff like this. They're all these kind of postmodernist kind of they could have a meaning, the potentia, and all this sort of stuff and things. And that was part of it. And I'm okay with that. That's all right. It's also, but I don't. I think this is also one of the things that maybe the more we write or the more I write that you lose is like at times it's terribly overwritten to me, but
uh,
that's also part of its energy.
yeah, yeah,
So it's kind of like I think if you took that away from it, I think as a first book it wouldn't do anything at all. I think this is it's something it's it's a comparatively youthful kind of energy and zest is it might be the only thing driving the story. you
And
know
it is being written by Tom, who does lie about what he's doing. Like where he's going to go write this, he's saying he's interviewing famous believe this right, famous rock star for like a big magazine, and then
yeah
internally is like, that's all a lie. I'm like,
yeah
really, I'm doing this other thing. Like
yeah
some of that portion I saw is like, if you're gonna say like go into like the overwritten or telling not showing part, is partially like that character. They're defining
yeah
that character as to like
now
how
that's
he would relate this
That's
story.
interesting you say that because that was one of the things at the start of the book. I was looking at that, and I knew obviously I was working with an unreliable narrator of some sort, and I needed them to be introduced a little bit, and I'm going to keep bringing them back in periodically so they didn't forget about this because
Right.
otherwise they're going, how could he possibly know that?
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and so there was that bit as well. But I also wanted there to be doubts about the veracity of what he was saying. So it's kind of like so, and even how you look at it, so like, how could you get all this out of conversation at an airport?
Yeah.
There's no way because he's done the narrator bit. He has bridged the human need for narrative. He has bridged the gap of the unknown with a plausible story.
Exactly.
And so in a way you get to the end of it. So and that was one of the places where sometimes I felt that was a bit ham-fisted. Other times I felt it worked. As I got towards the end, I can go, oh, I can see exactly what I was trying to do.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I didn't always, I'm not sure it always worked, but I could kind of see that I was trying my best to do it.
And that's admirable. That's super
Yeah.
admirable. Also, it's interesting that the first book has a blurb from both Colin McCann, who I really like, a smart, funny, intuitive book. It's his blurb on here. But then
Yeah.
John Waters, Magnificent Dispatch from the Republic of Boredom. I can't praise it enough. And until we got on this call, thought that was John Waters, the filmmaker.
No,
Um,
that is John Waters. He's a writer and a columnist here. And I think he was very kind and he was very good to it. And he was he's kind of, I don't know what's happened to him in recent years. He's kind of got himself into some crazy stuff. But
yeah,
there was a time where he was cutting edge and he was kind of, and he was quite, I think I would describe it as kind of, liberal and kind of socialist. And then he's gone kind of a different way. But he was very nice to me. And it was a very nice thing. And he got kind of behind that and gave us that. Colin McCann, I've met Colin 2 or 3 times, but the manuscript was passed on to him. He went to the same school as I did. I never knew him. He's a bit older than me. He wasn't there when I was there, but it was kind of passed through to him that way. And I figured we'd hear nothing. And then he kind of sent that back. And in the meantime, I think maybe I talked to him twice, maybe. So no, but that's how they came about. And actually, like you guys were talking about Irish writers, and I know that he's not a Dalkey author, but for me, McCann, like Dancer is an amazing book. I go, that could be a Dalkey book.
yeah, yeah,
That I just think that of all of his stuff, and I know he's got awards for loads of other things. I just look at that and I just thought that was like stylistically and structurally, and I just thought there was so much brilliant in that. That was an amazing piece of work.
I'm a big fan of his too. I thought that was funny. I like that you don't indicate what John Waters that is. Just let it
Yeah.
ride. Let everyone,
Oh,
impose their own.
yeah, and I think sure, and I think they stuck stuck Gollum's quote on the rest of the other two books as well. You know what
Yeah, I
I
think so too.
mean? Yeah,
I mean, why not? Why not?
yeah,
Why not?
yeah,
But I know we should probably start wrapping up. John, Vince, do you have
yeah.
other questions that you wanted to ask about?
Not necessarily, but I will say you mentioned Gatsby earlier, and it's funny. Like I'm looking at my notes app because I was taking notes while I was rereading this, and I think I even wrote, "This is Celtic Tiger Gatsby," because I had this big idea that I was trying to flesh out that I don't think I've quite figured out because I haven't read Gatsby in years either. But it's like Gatsby is such an American classic because it's this big, you just become a thing. You want to be this thing, you act the part, you become a thing, and then but it's this inescapable sense of who you really are catches up with you. And then obviously there's Nick, the narrator, who's telling us things. So it is structured. We have Tom telling
Yeah.
us the story of Stuart, as opposed to Nick telling us the story of Gatsby. But I'm like, is this the Celtic Tiger version where it's
Yeah,
like Stuart
Vince,
is
I
kind of
think it's
going through the motions of seeming?
yeah, Vince, I think I
Oh,
think whether consciously or subconsciously, that is undoubtedly there. You know,
okay.
I think there's no way it couldn't have been.
Yeah.
You know, yeah,
Hmm.
so that's a good catch. You weren't over
Okay,
interpreting
so I'll
there.
take
That's
it.
all right.
Yeah, my notes stop at a certain point because I sort of realized I think I'm really looking too deep into this, and I must pull back a little because I'm imposing this. I want it to fit. I want it to be like, but in the millennial generation or the a Celtic Tiger version of this, it's not about seeming because of self creation. It's about going through the motions of what the society expect. And I finally stopped. I'm like, okay, let's just assume that I'm going a little too far here. But I wanted there to be something like that because I felt like that is kind of what really locked into me is there's a fairly mysterious quality to Stuart where I recognize this kind of going through the motions, almost inertia of life. I mean, that's been my life for most of it until like a certain point you kind of realize, all right, I better start actually exercising some
Yes, yeah.
agency of my own rather than just let things happen to me, like
Hmm.
fall into a job and then that's what I do. But that felt very relatable in a sense. And I think that is something, I wonder if there is something like
Well,
fairly generational about that because,
a friend of mine, Vince,
oh,
described it as a bit of as a kind of as a time capsule of the book. And meaning, I think what he meant was that it captured a certain era that
Yeah.
was a bit bizarre. You know, looking back on it now, and standing in the middle of it, and a little bit like that. Gatsby experience and the Nick Carraway experience, kind of enjoying its extravagance while all the time feeling it's not right.
Yeah.
You know, and there was definitely an element of that kind of drove the book, I would say.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I really, as someone who, back when I graduated from college, worked some temp jobs that I just fell into and then like would quit them instantly because I was like, no, not doing this. I really relate to that part of it. The girl part, not so much, not so much.
Yeah.
Why not? There's no shock to anyone. It's
uh,
not prolific in that way, but anyways, it's a wonderful book. I am excited to read the other ones as well. I brought them with me on my little summer trip here, so I have them to read both, and I'm excited to hear like what this next book will be. You don't have to tease it too much since I know you want to,
yeah.
wait till it's done, but I'm excited to know that you have something in the
Yeah.
office.
Yeah. Thanks, Chaz. Thanks. Yeah. I've enjoyed this. This is really good.
This is super fun, super fun. So if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure and like and subscribe. If you're listening on Mining the Dalkey Archive, please subscribe to the podcast. There's also obviously the Substack. You can go there, follow along. Next up, I have two notes for us. One is the next book is Groton and Me by Tom O'Neill, which we'll
Oh,
be
I know
doing.
Tom.
Do you know Tom?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tom's
there you
lovely. Tom's lovely. Yeah.
Excellent. I haven't talked to him, but Declan O'Driscoll is thinking of coming on potentially to talk about the book. He's the one who pitched it to me way back when
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was doing
Okay.
like falling into things. Here's a
Yes.
funny
Yeah.
story to end with in a way. I For the University of Rochester, they had these alumni tours where like rich alums like pay money to go on like a special tour to a particular country region. And they're doing one with Ireland. And for whatever reason, I got hooked up with them. And they're like, you know, books. Ireland likes books. Do you want to do Dalkey? You worked at Dalkey Archive. That's Irish. Do you want to like lead like you don't have to lead the tour, but you give like speeches, presentations, talk about Irish literature, give the whole background. And I was like, oh, yeah, for sure. I've never been to Ireland. I'm not an expert. Let's go. Let's do
Yeah.
it. I
Yeah.
was rereading. I'm obviously like a huge Joyce fan, very into like Irish literature, but and Flann O'Brien, but like those kind of big name things. So I was
Yes.
reading
Yeah. Yeah.
stuff and mentioned this online, and Declan O'Driscoll's like, this is the best contemporary Irish book of our time is Groton and Me. And I was like, okay. I started reading. I was like, I do not have the bandwidth for this at this moment. I need to burn
Yeah.
through a bunch of like ton of French books and like things
Yeah.
that are like
Yeah.
that these people are gonna like. So I never got to it, but now I'm
Well,
excited to be able to read that.
Chad, one thing I think should be said, when I was listening to you guys talking in a previous episode, and you were talking about, and I think it was Vince brought it up, which was about the idea of, female Irish authors, and stuff like that. So obviously there's loads of them. I know and you talked about John's Gaze being kind of, quite male orientated, and I think that's fair enough. But like there are kind of loads of them out there, and but the person who I can think of who would be able to steer you best. She actually wrote a book about all the history of female writers. Was Sinead Gleason.
Okay.
She's a novelist now
Oh
herself,
yeah.
and she's a journalist. And I think the book, because here's the connection, the book is called, I think it's called The Long Gaze, but that is kind of, it's also a bit about Maeve Brennan in it, which is the long-winded lady, and there's bits stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, and so, but Sinead was, um, I've known her and seen her on TV, and I've said it's kind of you see her in publications and things like that. But when I was over at the Bay Area Book Festival in 2017,
Mhm.
I was on a panel with Paul Murray and Colin Barrett,
Oh
two
yeah.
lads who kind of real writers as I call them because I have a day job, and they're kind of that's how they cut their teeth. So they're the real brave people. But one and the presenter at the time, his name kind of had me said that Sinead had been on to her, given out that there was no female people, and I was actually on the panel, and I thought, well, there's only one person who's going to go. If we introduce another author, who's going to be which is going to be me. And I kind of made a joke about that, but I just know that Sinead is always championing female authors, and I think if you wanted to know where to go or who to talk about,
Yeah.
she seems to me like I don't know her personally at all, never met her, but she seems to me like somebody who would be able to give you a good steer on that.
I have no shame in emailing.
Yeah, she was.
That'd be great.
Please, please do because I as soon as you said that name, I'm like, I know the name, and then I just checked. I heard her on the Backlisted podcast talking about a Mary Brennan book that I haven't read, one of her short story collections, and that's what. And I remember hearing her on the interview and thinking that she was really very funny and sharp and interesting. And I really was like, I got to look up this book that she's talking about, and then I absolutely didn't. So now I'll have to add it to my list because it sounds
Yeah.
absolutely, definitely sounds up my alley.
Oh, absolutely. I have a note for you, Vince. There's one other Pink Dalkey book, Upstaged by Jacques Chouet,
Oh,
is Pink. I was trying to pull it up for the longest time as after you said that. I was like, I know there's one more. Can't get there. I got there. Jacques Chouet.
oh well,
Jacques is one of the writers we had into my school to talk to the students.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
really.
all ties
yeah, yeah,
together. He's amazing.
yeah. That's
Mountain
it. So I
Hour
remember.
was translated by Brian Evanson. Was one of the first. Was the
Yeah.
first Chouet book that we did, and
Oh,
it's
okay.
super fun. Love it. So if
Yeah.
you're listening, follow along, recommend us to your friends, buy the books, buy Sleepwalker, buy Slipping, buy Huddleston Road. That's the best way that you can support us and support what we're doing. Till next time, I've got nothing else.